In 1968, the world was living on the edge. People looked at the stars, dreaming of the moon, but below, under the water column, there was something that no one talked about. The hum of the Cold War filled the air. Each country sought to look further, higher, deeper. In the USA, in buildings without windows, behind long rows of computers and ozone. Smelling cables, a project was born that did not officially exist. It was called Project Abyss. Even those who signed the financing reports did not know about it. For the press, it was a program to study ocean pressure, necessary to test the strength of new alloys. For the military, this is another reason to observe the Soviet Union. But for those few who saw the first recordings from underwater sensors, the meaning was completely different. They knew it wasn't about the materials, and not about the depth. The satellites were the first to raise the alarm. In January 1968, at the height of the winter storms, the Orbital Observation Station recorded bursts of radio noise from the Pacific Ocean, southeast of Guam. The signals were strange, short pulses, repeated with a uniform frequency, like a heartbeat. No known sources fit these parameters. NASA's Space Radar Research Team redirected its attention down to the water. Calculations have shown that the signals come from a depth of over 10,000 meters. First, we thought about geological processes, volcanic activity, cracks in the Earth's crust. But the spectral analysis showed a clear structure, as if someone or something was transmitting a sequence of data. Then they decided not to disclose the find. The project was classified within a day. In March, a meeting was held at the Houston Control Center. In the dark room, illuminated only by the soft glow of the screens, there were people in white shirts and narrow ties. There were photographic films, printouts of graphs, and magnetic coils on the table. The speaker spoke dryly, almost without emotion. The signals are stable. The frequency is 4.2 Hz, repeated every 37 minutes. On the film, there is a gray stripe interspersed with white dots, like the pulse of an unknown organism. We can't identify the source. One of the military men chuckled. Maybe the Russians are digging their way to the bottom? The laughter quickly died down. That was the first time there was a proposal to send a probe. This is how the idea of the DeepScan 3 device was born. The device was assembled on the basis of old prototypes of deep-sea capsules, but hundreds of changes were made. The case thickness is twice that of the previous models. The cameras are sensitive with an infrared range. Inside there is a magnetic tape recording module, protected from pressure. It looked too complicated to be just a pressure study. The engineers didn't ask any questions. They signed the documents, got admission, went down to the compartment and worked 20 hours a day. Sometimes people in unmarked black suits walked along the corridors, checking devices and making notes in notebooks. They didn't introduce themselves. Some whispered that it was the CIA, others that it was naval intelligence. As a result, no one could say for sure who was in charge of the project. Even the chief engineer. In July, the device was ready. He was loaded onto the ship Pacific Spear, sailing under the flag of the research program. The ship left Guam in the early morning, when the sea was calm and the air was still. According to official documents, materials are tested for durability. The real thing is the descent to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. No one expected to see something unusual. No one except those who have already seen the first transcripts. The signals continued to go off. They seemed to be waiting for something. The launch of DeepScan 3 started at exactly 6:45. The metal body slowly disappeared under the waves. There was silence on the deck, only the crackle of the radio. The device sank lower and lower, transmitting data. Rows of numbers appeared on the screens in Houston: pressure, temperature, radiation. Everything was going smoothly. At a depth of 7,000 meters, the first disturbance appeared. A short jump in the signal, as if someone had answered. Experts attributed it to the influence of water density. But after a few minutes it happened again, the same pulse, the same frequency, 4.2 Hz. There was a dull, low tone on the microphone recording, like a distant thunderclap. The operator noted, "The acoustic noise is unidentified." No one reacted. At a depth of 10,200 meters, The searchlight of the device illuminated the bottom. The sand was smooth, without rocks, without currents. Suddenly, something appeared in the background. At first it seemed like a shadow, then lines. Smooth, even parallel, as if processed by a machine. The camera rotated slowly, illuminating wider and wider, until it seemed that walls loomed in the thick darkness. Symmetrical structures extending into the distance. One of the observers in the control center whispered, "This is impossible." The lines formed a right angle, similar to the entrance. The scanners recorded the metallic reflection. Then, for the first time, the command sounded, "Come closer." The Deep Scan 3 was moving slowly. The light picked out more and more details, surfaces covered with strange patterns, as if carved from the inside. The camera caught a glimmer, and a gate appeared ahead. Huge, embedded in the bottom, covered with symbols resembling star charts. Some of the signs were familiar constellations, galactic patterns. Others are indecipherable. The cameraman took a picture. After a moment, the image began to shake, as if the water itself was vibrating. And then the camera caught movement. 3 dark silhouettes in the distance. The Deep Scan 3 was moving slowly. The light picked out more and more details, surfaces covered with strange patterns, as if carved from the inside. The camera caught a glimmer, and a gate appeared ahead. Huge, embedded in the bottom, covered with symbols resembling star charts. Some of the signs were familiar constellations, galactic patterns. Others are indecipherable. The cameraman took a picture. After a moment, the image began to shake, as if the water itself was vibrating. And then the camera caught movement. 3 dark silhouettes in the distance. They moved slowly, without bubbles, without jets, as if they did not obey the physics of water. One of those who were watching tried to zoom in on the image, and the screen flashed white. The connection was cut off. On the deck of the Pacific Spear, an operator wearing headphones heard a sharp whistle, then silence. The phone was not responding. 3 minutes later, the pressure sensors showed a jump, as if something massive had collapsed on him. 2 more minutes later, there was a complete lack of signal. The attempt to restore contact lasted more than an hour, with no result. Then the ship's commander ordered the mission to be completed. The magazine wrote, "The device is lost." The connection was cut off. On the deck of the Pacific Spear, an operator wearing headphones heard a sharp whistle, then silence. The phone was not responding. 3 minutes later, the pressure sensors showed a jump, as if something massive had collapsed on him. 2 more minutes later, there was a complete lack of signal. The attempt to restore contact lasted more than an hour, with no result. Then the ship's commander ordered the mission to be completed. The magazine wrote, "The device is lost. The reason is a technical malfunction." The recording was sent to Houston, but after a few hours the order came, "Destroy all the materials and return to base." No questions were answered, just a short one, "The project is closed." A week later, a meeting was held at the control center. Charred pieces of metal lay on the long table, all that had been lifted. No one could explain why the parts of the hull were melted, as if they had been exposed to high temperature. Cameras, data blocks, everything is destroyed, except for one thing, a small segment of magnetic tape, no longer than the palm of your hand. It only has 42 seconds of recording time. No one knew how it had been preserved. When the engineers turned on the film, the screen flashed with static, then a frame appeared. A glowing object on the bottom, surrounded by a flickering halo. And a week later, a meeting was held at the control center. Charred pieces of metal lay on the long table, all that had been lifted. No one could explain why the parts of the hull were melted, as if they had been exposed to high temperature. Cameras, data blocks, everything is destroyed, except for one thing, a small segment of magnetic tape, no longer than the palm of your hand. It only had 2 seconds of recording, no ode been preserved. When the engineers turned on the film, the screen flashed with static, then a frame appeared. A glowing object on the bottom, surrounded by a flickering halo, and there's an inhuman silhouette in. The old man died at the beginning of winter, when there was a viscous cold over the house and snow settled on the roofs, as if someone had covered the city with a shroud. There was no electricity in the house that evening, just the faint light of a kerosene lamp reflected in the glass of his glasses. He called his son softly, in a whisper, as if he was afraid that someone would hear. "Down there, in the basement. Take it. Don't open it right away." After these words, he did not utter another sound. His hand remained suspended in the air, and his eyes were open, staring somewhere into the darkness. When his son, Michael, found the box, he did not understand why it smelled of sea salt, as if it had been lying in dampness for years. The word abyss was burned into the lid. No signatures, no dates. Only this sign is like a warning. At first, Michael wasn't going to open it. He didn't believe in secrets, and he wasn't interested in his father's past. Raymond Kess was a shadow to him, a man who came home late, didn't answer questions, and lived in the world of his drawings. After his death, there were only papers, old appliances, and this box. But at night, when the house was plunged into silence, Michael heard a strange sound coming from the basement, as if the film was slowly rewinding. He went downstairs. The box was in the same place, but the lid was slightly ajar. The inside smelled of dust and old metal. He turned on the lamp. Inside were several magnetic coils, yellowed photographs, and an envelope labeled Project Abyss, Confidential. Underneath it is a VHS cassette with a worn label. No signatures. Date only, July 1968. He took out the tape, wiped it with his sleeve, and held it up to the light. The film was partially crumpled inside, but intact. There was a TV and a VCR in my father's old house, which hadn't been turned on for probably 10 years. He stretched the cables, pressed the power button. The screen came to life, hissed softly. When he inserted the tape, the image was blurry at first. A series of static, gray stripes, then the NASA logo flashed, old and faded, and then the inscription, Project Abyss, classified recording. Michael's heart was pounding fast. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he felt that he couldn't watch it alone. The image was shaking. The camera is obviously installed on board the ship. The voice, over is metallic, dry, with the noise of radio communication. Deep scan 3. The decline is stable. The pressure is critical. 10,000 meters. The contact has been established. Then there are long seconds of silence. There is darkness on the screen. Suddenly, the spotlight cut through the darkness. The camera captured a smooth surface that looked like polished metal. Michael squinted at the lines, patterns, shapes, as if they were part of a construction. Suddenly, the image wavered, and shadows flashed across the frame. 3, maybe 4. They were moving in the water. Then light filled the screen, bright and blinding. And it all ended. A dull, low hum came from the speakers. Michael recoiled. The recording ended. He rewound it. He tried again. In the same second, there was light, noise. Then, for a moment, a silhouette appeared in the reflection of the glass of the cabin. Human height, but not human. The body is elongated. The arms are longer than usual. The facial features are indistinct, as if the water was blurring them. But the main thing is the eyes. They were burning, not reflecting the light, but radiating it. Michael stopped recording, turned off the tape recorder, and sat down on the floor. The silence rang in my ears. He felt that he had seen not just a frame, but something that should not have been on film. In the envelope, besides the tape, there were reports. He opened one. The signals are confirmed. The frequency is stable. The source is unidentified. Suspicion of artificial origin. Next are the pages marked Top Secret and signed by my father. Michael read until dawn. The documents described a mission about which there was not a single record in the archives. There were diagrams of the DeepScan 3 device, tables, depth markers, and strange graphs, wavy lines that repeat every 37 minutes. The abnormal signals are a match with the data from the Horizon satellite. His father's handwriting is in the margins. They are not underwater. They're downstairs. The phrase seemed meaningless, but there was fear inside it. Not a single word sounded so personal. My father, who never talked about work, wrote about something that broke him. The following pages were worse. Photos taken from the screen. They were blurry and grainy, but you could make out a structure on them. Something like a gate, huge and uneven, stretching into the darkness. In one of the photos, there is an indistinct figure at the base. On the back is the signature, 719, visual contact. Michael flipped through another one. It was a face shot, probably from a film, but not human. The jaw is elongated, the eyes are round, without pupils. And again, the same caption, 719. He closed the envelope. It was impossible to understand why his father had kept it for 30 years. Fragments of his childhood surfaced in his memory. How once, when he was a child, his father woke up at night in a cold sweat, looking out the window and whispering, "They're watching from below." It seemed like a nightmare at the time. Now it's a warning. The last file contained a sheet torn from the report. The DeepScan 3 instrument recorded a gravity deviation within 0.3%. The water temperature dropped by 12 degrees Celsius in 4 seconds. Possible opening of a cavity under the seabed. At the bottom is the signature, R. Kess, and the inscription in pencil, "They are not dead." With that, Michael was left alone. In the morning, he tried to find at least some information about Project Abyss. There's nothing in NASA's public archives. Not a single record. There was not even a mention of the DeepScan 3 model. He wrote a letter to the archives of the Office of Oceanic Research. The reply came 3 days later. No data was found for the query. A project with that name is not listed. No signature, no contacts. Only the cold wording, as if the system itself had rejected his request. A week later, the dreams began. Michael saw the sea. Deep, black, without reflections. There is light at the bottom. He descended lower and lower, feeling pressure in his temples, until he could make out the outlines of the gate. The symbols glowed with a soft light, like a pulse. There was a low, continuous hum coming from behind them. And then there are the eyes, the same as on the recording. When he woke up, his heart was beating with such force, as if he was really underwater. The room smelled of salt. One night, he heard the TV turn on by itself. The screen was blinking. There is white noise on it. Then the image is the same scene as on the film. The camera zooms in on the gate. But now the recording took longer. The silhouettes were moving closer. One of them came close to the lens. His eyes lit up, and Michael realized that the recording was going on in real time. He pulled the plug out of the socket. The screen went blank. But on the glass, in the reflection, a silhouette flashed for a second, the same one as in the frame. He ran out of the house, into the street, into the darkness. The air was cold and humid, as if from the depths of the ocean. It seemed to him that the walls were breathing, that somewhere in the distance he could hear that same hum. He stood under a streetlight until it was light. Returning to the house, he locked all the doors and hid the box in the closet. But the dreams didn't stop. On the contrary, they were getting brighter. Sometimes he woke up to hear a soft clicking sound coming from under the floor, repeated every 37 minutes. Then he realized that the signal was continuing, that what they found in 1968 has not disappeared. It was just waiting. The spring of 2000 brought with it long rains and a wet cold that chilled the bones. Michael did not leave the house unnecessarily. The box of films remained closed, but thoughts of it would not let go. He tried to immerse himself in his work, forget about the strange dreams and night sounds, but it proved impossible. Every ring of the phone caused alarm. Every rustle caused suspicion. It seemed that the world around him was filled with the same hum that he had heard in the depths of the water. He decided to start with what he was familiar with, the people who worked with his father. The first was a professor at the Houston Institute, an old scientist with whom Raymond kept in touch. The meeting in a small office littered with books and old equipment began with a long silence. When Michael showed the photos and mentioned Project Abyss, the professor flinched. He spoke softly, cautiously, as if he was afraid that invisible listeners were standing outside the walls of the office. "You don't have to do this, Michael. What the father found must not be shown. Not for human eyes, even after 30 years. But Michael couldn't stop. With each page of documents, with each frame of the film, the feeling of horror grew. The professor said that Project Abyss did exist, but only as an inconspicuous branch of NASA research, hidden from the whole world. They were looking for anomalies at depth, Michael. Not just pressure and temperature. Something else. Something alive or intelligent. He explained that the 1968 signals corresponded to frequencies that were not found in nature, either acoustic or magnetic, and that, according to their calculations, the objects under the bottom could not be natural. The creatures you saw there could be watching us. They could wait. Michael couldn't get away from those words. He returned home, but the feeling of presence intensified. Light filtered through the windows, but the shadows seemed unnaturally long. Sometimes he heard clicks under the floor, smooth and precise, like a metronome. He tried to ignore them, but one night the sound got louder, turning into a low rumble. He turned on the tape again. On the screen there are gates, symbols, light, and silhouette. But now the movement has become closer. It seemed that the figure was not approaching the camera, but the viewer. Michael felt that his gaze was fixed. He recoiled, and that was the first time he realized it wasn't just a recording. This is the message. He decided to go to the place of events, to the archipelago off Guam, where the ship Pacific Spear began the expedition. Find the people who were still alive. Among them are old engineers, navigation officers who serviced the device. They were all elderly. Many suffered from illnesses, and their memory was failing. But Michael was hoping for bits of information. The first was the captain of the ship. He spoke slowly, through a trembling voice. "We didn't see anything. The device is gone. No one saw anything but those numbers and the glowing lines. We signed the papers. We can't talk." But his eyes betrayed fear. Something was tormenting him. Michael realized that even after 30 years, the consequences of what was hidden in the depths did not let them go. Then Michael met an engineer who worked on DeepScan 3 cameras. The man trembled at the sight of the pictures. He said that some of the footage had been deleted from the tapes, and that the device recorded not only the image but also resonant waves that could affect the psyche of the observer. This was the first time Michael had heard about the danger, not related to water or depth, but to the very presence of the object. They're not just alive, they're smart. They know we're watching, and we don't have to look. Returning home, Michael noticed that strange things were happening around his house. The lights were flashing for no reason, and the windows were covered with condensation, even though the air was dry. At night, he heard whispers, barely discernible, as if from deep within. Sometimes it seemed that someone was standing outside the door, but when he approached, there was nothing. He began to notice changes in himself. A sharp feeling of pressure in his chest, anxiety attacks for no reason, a constant feeling that he was being watched. Michael understood. What Father kept in the box was not just a record of the mission. It was a warning. Something they discovered in 1968 wasn't dead, wasn't abandoned. It waited, watched, reacted. And the more he tried to find out the truth, the stronger that influence became. Finally, he returned to the tapes and began comparing frames, dates, and schedules. The signals, repeated every 37 minutes, matched the rhythm of his dreams, with the night sounds under the floor. He realized that the connection was ongoing. Something from the depths is trying to reach out. But for what, it remained a mystery. He did not know that this would start a process that would drag him into a story that goes much further than the DeepScan 3 mission and force him to face something that a person should never have seen. Summer had turned hot, but inside Michael's house there was a damp coolness, as if the space itself reacted to what he had discovered. He spent hours in front of his father's tapes, drawings, and documents, comparing symbols, depth markers, and signal data. Each new detail seemed to be connected with the ancient maps of constellations painted on the walls of the device, and with the numbers that were repeated on magnetic tapes. It was as if someone, or something, was down there trying to tell a story, explain its presence. But whether it was a mind or a trap, Michael couldn't figure out. Sleep became rare, but painful. In the silence of the night, it seemed to him that the walls were breathing, and the floor was shaking under his feet. Sometimes, through the noise of the ventilation, a dull low hum could be heard, almost identical to the sounds on the film. He recorded it on a dictaphone and listened to it. The signal was repeated every 37 minutes. Michael realized that this was not just a coincidence. The object was reacting to him, to his actions, to attempts to understand. He began to feel pressure in his chest, dizziness, and an overwhelming sense of anxiety when he was near the box. It seemed that time was changing around him. The clock could stop or slow down. He decided on a trip to the NASA archives, although he understood that the chance of finding something official was minimal. In the documentation center, he was faced with emptiness. All records about Project Abyss had disappeared. But among the old magnetic media, he found a file marked Restricted Deep Scan 3 Recovery. His heart started pounding. The recording was fragmentary, but it contained footage that wasn't in my father's box. In them, the camera zoomed in on the gates under the Mariana Trench. The symbols on the walls glowed as if responding to the presence of the device, and in the depths there were shadows that moved almost as if alive. One of the silhouettes stretched out his hand, but not to the camera, to the viewer, and the image trembled, as if the very fabric of the water was bending under the pressure of the gaze. Michael returned home in a state of almost complete exhaustion. He began to notice changes in himself, more drastic and dangerous. The reflection in the mirror sometimes lingered for a split second, and he saw a shadow behind his back that did not match his own silhouette. Sometimes the objects in the room changed position, but no one could explain it logically. He stopped going out, and the fear of the unknown became unbearable. In the evenings, he could hear the same rhythmic clicking under the floor, a low rumble and a whisper that could not be made out in words, but which he felt like an order. Look deeper. Michael started working with character matrices, tracing them out anew on paper. He noticed that the patterns formed curves that repeated at certain intervals, similar to coordinates and constellations, which could correspond not only to the underwater structure, but also to space objects. It seemed that this was not a map of the Earth, but a map of space that intersects reality. He realized that what was at the bottom of the Mariana Trench was not limited to water or time, but that the influence extended far beyond the ocean. One night, the signal reached its limit. Michael felt that something was present nearby, invisible, but palpable as a cold pressing on his chest. Suddenly, the lights started flashing, and a glow appeared in the room, similar to the light reflected on the film. He froze, and a silhouette appeared from the depths of the light. Not completely tangible, not quite visible, but present in such a way that the air compressed around him. The shadow held out its hand, and Michael felt a thought, not in words, but in a way. They were watching, they knew he had seen them. And now he stood on the borderline between knowledge and danger. He realized one thing: to understand what was hidden under the ocean, he had to go there again. The records, documents, and diagrams themselves were not just evidence of the past. It was an invitation. Or a trap. Michael felt that if he didn't take a step, the signal would continue to haunt him, penetrate his consciousness, compress reality around him. He prepared for the expedition by studying the routes, contacts with former engineers, and possible dive sites. He was filled with a mixture of horror and determination. He knew that nothing would be the same after he went back to the bottom. And so, with a box of films, maps, and equipment, Michael stood on the threshold of the unknown. What would open up in front of him could be more ancient than humanity, not limited by time and space, and at the same time extremely dangerous. The signals continued to go on. The hidden structure waited, and the depth under the Mariana Trench breathed. Michael understood that the next meeting would be the last, and how he would survive it would depend not only on his understanding, but perhaps on reality itself. Summer was gradually giving way to a humid autumn, but inside Michael, the heat was raging. A mixture of anxiety and determination. A box of films, maps, recordings, and old drawings of the Deep Scan 3 accompanied him at every step, as if they were giving him vague guidance left by his father. He understood that any mistake could cost him his mind, possibly his life, and that an object hidden in the depths of the Mariana Trench was watching his every action. The signals kept coming, every 37 minutes, like the rhythm of his own heart. But now he perceived them not as an accident, but as a call to something that couldn't be ignored. Michael started preparing for the expedition. He rented an old research vessel equipped with deep-sea diving equipment and purchased an underwater vehicle similar to the DeepScan 3, with an improved recording system and sensors. Every day he checked the instruments, cameras, spotlights, checked the pressure in the capsule. He carefully calculated the route and depth of the dive, but the more he prepared, the more clearly he felt that the true challenge was not in the technique, but in what was at the very bottom. Every day he felt the pressure of an unknown, invisible and at the same time tangible, as if the water itself conveyed a thought that could not be read in words. The night before the dive, Michael barely slept a wink. The house was quiet, but there was a low rumble coming from the basement, a familiar, repetitive signal. He turned on the tape one last time. Gates, symbols, and silhouettes flashed on the screen. He saw them so close that he could almost feel their breath. And again, the feeling of observation flashed, but now it was stronger, more intrusive. His consciousness fluctuated between fear and curiosity, and in this fluctuation he realized one simple truth. To understand what they are, you need to face them face to face. In the morning, Michael went on deck. The fog slowly rose from the sea, hiding the horizon, creating the illusion of endless water. The device was ready. The cabin was narrow, the pressure was inflated, the systems were checked. He sat inside, fixed the straps, turned on the power. Before diving, he looked at the depth map and marked the place where, according to archival data, the gate stood. It was 6:37 on the clock, 7 minutes before the next pulse. He felt that something more was starting right now. The dive started slowly. At first, the water was clear, the light of the spotlights reflected on the clouds of fine suspension. The deeper he descended, the less light there was, the denser the darkness became. 3 hours later, he reached 10,000 meters. The pressure squeezed the body of the device, but the structures withstood. And then, at a depth of 10,200 meters, he saw this, the gate. Huge, covered with symbols, glowing with a faint inner glow. They were both majestic and alien, as if the art was not of this world. The patterns on the surface moved as if reacting to the presence of the device, as if the object understood that it was being observed. The cameras captured 3 silhouettes in the distance, trembling and clear at the same time. They approached without creating bubbles and waves, as if they were sliding in water, not obeying the laws of physics. Michael felt a strange pressure in his head, a mixture of fear and hypnotic attraction. He turned on the recording. Symbols appeared on the screen, illuminated more brightly by the spotlight, and a face flashed in the reflection of the porthole, not human. His eyes glowed with an inner light, as if they were reading his thoughts. There was a vibration inside the cabin, barely noticeable, but felt by the whole body. Michael felt that the space around him was changing. The walls of the apparatus seemed transparent. The water inside the capsule was dense, as if gel-like, and the symbols on the gate were alive. He realized that the object is capable of influencing consciousness. Fear and curiosity mingled, and time seemed to stretch out. At that moment, he felt the presence of not one, but several minds. The silhouettes approached. Michael felt as if his mind was resonating with them. At first, it was an incomprehensible feeling. Voices, words, images that do not form sentences, but are intuitively understandable. He saw maps of other worlds, unknown technologies, structures existing outside of space and time. And then he realized that the gate is not just a physical object, but an interface between reality and another form of existence that humanity should not have seen. He tried to back away, but the machine seemed to be moving by itself, heading inside the gate. The symbols on the walls shimmered, forming signs that Michael felt in his body, in his thoughts, in his breath. His mind was teetering on the edge of madness, but at the same time he understood. They are not aggressive, but they observe, learn, and check. Every impulse in my head is like a question. Are you ready to understand? Michael felt that if he turned away now, he would lose the chance, perhaps forever. He took a step forward. A spotlight illuminated the inner cavity behind the gate. There was darkness there, dense and alive. Figuratively, the space expanded, but physically it seemed compressed. He noticed structures that looked like cylinders and platforms extending into the depths. Lines of light shimmered around them, and silhouettes moved among them like the conductors of an unknown symphony. Michael realized that this was not a world, but a system with its own logic, intelligence, perhaps even morality. He tried to record everything on the cameras, but the images were constantly distorted. Sometimes symbols appeared on the screen that could not be reproduced. Not letters, not numbers, but pure patterns of consciousness. They affected the viewer. Fear, delight, understanding, horror, all at the same time. Michael felt that the boundaries between himself and the object were disappearing. He wasn't just watching, he was a part of it. And then a feeling arose. They don't want to do any harm. They want contact, knowledge sharing, and consciousness expansion. Light appeared inside the device, absorbing space. The symbols shimmered and intertwined, creating maps of worlds, coordinates of galaxies, images of creatures that man had never seen. Michael felt that his father's memory, his own fears, and his knowledge of the project were all preparation for this moment. He realized that his father had not seen an object, but the beginning of a contact that humanity should not have initiated ahead of time. Now he was faced with a choice: to leave and keep his mind, or to go deeper and risk becoming part of a new reality. He took a step inside. The pressure of thoughts, light, and sound became almost unbearable, but he felt harmony, an understanding of structure, and an unknown logic. At that moment, he realized that the object was not a threat in the usual sense, not a monster or an enemy. It is a form of consciousness that exists outside of time, reacts to observation, and is capable of influencing matter and the psyche. And the gate is a bridge, an interface through which you can communicate, learn, and understand the world differently. After a long period of exposure, Michael felt a pullback. The lights and sounds gradually decreased, the structures disappeared, the symbols stopped shimmering. The device returned to the familiar space of the water. He was alone but not scared. There was a feeling inside. He had seen things that were not human, and now, at least partially, he understood the structure of the world. When the craft surfaced, Michael went on deck. The fog still hung over the sea, but the air became lighter. He felt tired, but there was clarity in it. The box of tapes, the maps, his father's notes. All these now seemed to be the keys, the preparation for what he had been through. He realized that he could not tell the world about what he had seen, but the very fact of contact changed him forever. Michael returned home. During the night, he heard the faint rumble again, but now it wasn't fear, but a reminder. A reminder that the secrets of the depths exist, and that humanity is just beginning to touch them. The box of films remained on the shelf as a monument to curiosity and caution. He sat down, opened his father's diary, and wrote a few words. "We saw, we get it, but the world is not ready." And at that moment, the darkness outside the windows seemed peaceful. The symbols on the films and the glowing gates remained in memory, but they no longer threatened. They have become part of history, the story that the depths are not empty, that observation and knowledge are not always right, but sometimes a test. Michael closed the diary, turned off the light, and fell asleep. In his dream, there were gates, lights, and shadows again, but this time he felt no fear. He was an observer, part of a system that had been waiting patiently for centuries. And in this observation, there was an understanding that the world is wider than it seems, that the secrets of the depths are not the end, but the beginning of a new consciousness.